So period one is the we go back to front, but period one is the last period of U.S. history that we're going to do in the review. And period one begins before the voyages of Columbus by really giving a basic survey of what Native American life looks like in North America before Europeans arrive. And we have to say that a few things about that life for just a moment, right? First, there's incredible diversity in North America and in South America. We have to think there's two continents. Perhaps 100 million people are living here. Perhaps as many as 500 different ethnicities, in other words, languages and cultures. Political groups are living here. Some are at war with one another. Some are living harmoniously with one another. Almost all of them are living in such a way that they're dictated by the natural environment in which they live. Their way of life, their culture is based around it. The great advanced societies of the Native American world existed in what would be Latin America today. We're talking about the Aztec and, for example, and the Maya. The other great civilization of the period before European contact or on the eve of European contact are the Inca, who were living in South America. Most of the great cultures of North America, like the Mississippians, for example, and the Puebloans, who are living in present-day New Mexico and in Arizona and parts of Colorado and southern and southeastern Utah, these groups are really what we might say are in decline by the time Europeans actually arrive. But we do have to say this as well. There's basically no unity. There's no cohesion between these 500 differing groups of Native Americans on the eve of European contact. The other thing that we have to say about them is that in terms of their agricultural development, the Native Americans were light years ahead of the Europeans of their time. So European diets, for example, during the period would have consisted of grains, breads, meat, milk, lots of carbohydrates, lots of proteins, right? Native Americans, on the other hand, had meats as well. Deer meat, venison, bison, for example, elk, moose, fish in abundance. They would have also had access to various types of fowl as well. Birds, for example, that they could use for food. Turkeys were indigenous to North America. Now, but we have to think about all of this for just a moment. Native Americans are genetically engineering corn and have done so by the time of European contact. Native Americans have genetically engineered the potato in South America. Tomatoes grow here indigenously. A wide variety of fruits and vegetables are growing here in the Americas that Europeans have never seen. And Native Americans are using this very diet. They're quite a healthy people by the time that the Europeans arrived. In fact, in Columbus's first letter that he writes to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who sponsor his voyage, the monarchs of Spain, one of the first things that Columbus discusses is how healthy and how abundant the land is that the Native Americans are living on. He describes them as these very athletic, almost beautiful people, in essence. He also, however, describes them in another way that's very important for us. He says that they're very timid, they're very gullible, they're very naive, right? And of course, we know that Europeans, throughout this period of first contact, are going to take advantage of those qualities in the Native Americans. The Native Americans had been living in North America as early as 10,000 BC. The vast majority of them, of course, migrated across what would be the Bering Land Bridge. At the end of the last ice age, right, water levels rose, and so this land bridge, of course, was covered by what would be the Bering Sea today. But before that, during the Ice Age, when water levels were subsumed, we saw submerged pieces of land that enabled a large number of people, hunters and gatherers, to be able to move from what would be Siberia today into what would be Alaska today. And eventually, over the course of, and we keep pushing the date back further and further and further, we have a number of, an ever-growing number of people who make their way across this land bridge and into the Americas. Now for us, it's pretty interesting. When we look at the Native Americans and the type of cultures that we saw hunter-gatherers, we saw farming cultures, we saw cultures that had tremendous political systems. The Inca, for example, had what we might call today a form of socialism, a form of a welfare state almost, right? The more advanced civilizations had road systems that they had developed. They had advanced architecture that they had developed. By and large, one thing can be said about the Native American groups that are living prior to European contact that's really important for us to understand and very unique as well. And that is the aspect of trade, intercontinental trade. We see people actually eating fish as far north as Kansas, who, for example, were getting the types of seafood from the Pacific coast, the western areas of Mexico, what would be Acapulco today, for example, right? And that's a stunning thought for most of us, this idea that Native American trade was so much more extensive than what we ever thought between groups. Europeans coming really puts a dent into all of these aspects of what's happening with Native American life. From the beginning, Europeans did not intend to stay in the Americas. In fact, when we're talking about Columbus and most of the early European explorers who follow him, the vast majority of them come because Columbus, in essence, is making a mistake. He thinks he is in islands off the coast of what, of course, he believed to be China. But the reality is that Columbus has bumped into the Americas. He's essentially sailed into the Bahamas and later into Puerto Rico and later Cuba and what becomes the U.S. Virgin Islands eventually. Most of the explorers who follow Columbus are just that, explorers. It's not until the early 16th century that Spanish explorers even begin the process of realizing that they in fact have bumped into two new continents or land masses that had not been on the maps of European explorers until this happened. And then we see this wave of exploration begin to open up doors to the exploration of the North American interior. In 1512, Vasco Núñez Balboa actually crosses what would be Panama today and discovers the Pacific Ocean for the first time, proving that in fact Columbus had found two new continents, and therefore there was much more of a wider world that Europeans would have to cross if they're going westward, right, to reach Asia. Second, Ponce de Leon discovers Florida at about the same time in 1513. In 1519, there are two critical expeditions. One is headed by Alonso Alvarez de Pineda from Florida all the way to Mexico. He maps the Gulf Coast of the present-day United States. He's also, of course, the first European to see what would be the land of Texas, right? I want us to think about this for just a second. While Pineda is mapping out the Gulf Coast and seeing that North America is much larger than what the Spanish had ever thought that it was, another conquistador by the name of Hernando Cortez is poised to conquer the mighty Aztec Native American Empire in Mexico. And what Cortez discovers, and later Francisco Pizarro, when he conquers the Inca in South America, is that there are tremendous deposits of gold and silver in Latin America. Silver in South America in particular, pockets of gold in North America, and silver mines in what would be northern Mexico today. For the most part, the Spanish are content to actually try to extract as much of these resources as possible. The other piece of the puzzle that we need to understand about Spanish exploration is this. Once Pineda maps the extent of the Gulf Coast of the present-day southern United States, once Pizarro and Cortez discover that there's vast amounts of mineral wealth in in what would be Mexico and parts of Peru and Bolivia today, it inspires the Spanish to send two major expeditions up into what becomes the continental United States. First, there's another expedition that follows Pineda's route that also inspires these two grand expeditions. It's led by a man by the name of Panfilio de Narvaez. Narvaez becomes shipwrecked near what is present-day Tampa Bay, Florida. The survivors of that shipwreck become marooned near present-day Tampa, Florida. Hostile Native Americans force them to build boats and to sail Pineda's route along the Gulf Coast of the United States. The survivors of that expedition become shipwrecked on what is today Galveston Island, not terribly far away from where we are right now. The leader of those survivors, the ragged castaways, is Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. And for the next 6 to 8 years, de Vaca lives among the Native American groups of what will be Texas and parts of New Mexico, northern Mexico. And what de Vaca discovers is that the Native Americans, in fact, are quite human, right? In fact, they mourn their death. When the Spanish die on Galveston Island, some of the Spaniards actually resort to cannibalism on Galveston Island, not the Native Americans. It's the Native Americans who are sickened by what they see from the Europeans who have landed in their midst, unfortunately. De Vaca's 8-year journey across Texas, across the American Southwest, he becomes the first European to see a variety of Native American groups and live among them. And without their help, he would not, and his compadres would not have survived this process. De Vaca's expedition and the tales the Native Americans tell him of legendary cities of gold inspire the two expeditions that are to come. The first is by Hernando de Soto. De Soto's expedition lands in Florida and explores much of the southeastern United States. De Soto dies whenever the expedition reaches the Mississippi River. The Native Americans, fearful of the De Soto expedition, try to lure the De Soto expedition into areas where the soldiers in the expedition cannot subsist off of the land very easily, taking them as far out as in central and west Texas, what we call the Texas Hill Country today, or the Edwards Plateau region, to try to starve the Spaniards, to try to get rid of them. The other expedition is led by Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. Coronado's expedition explores the present-day New Mexico, parts of Arizona. His men are the first to see the Sky City of Vacoma and the Grand Canyon. They're the first to see the Great Plains as they go across the Texas Panhandle and parts of Oklahoma and up into Kansas. The Native Americans lure Coronado's expedition up into Kansas for a reason, right? They lure that expedition up there because they believe there are societies that are powerful enough to deal with the Spaniards, to in fact kill them. Coronado's expedition sees the forerunners of the Native Americans of the plains. It also sees, for the very first time, it sees the buffalo or the bison in overwhelming numbers on the high plains of Texas and parts of Oklahoma and Kansas. But ultimately, what Coronado and De Soto's expeditions do not find becomes the most important component of this discussion in this period. They find no mineral wealth. They find no gold or silver as they had found in Peru, Bolivia, parts of Ecuador, and of course in northern Mexico. So therefore, the Spanish begin the process in the 1540s of having virtually no interest in the lands north of Mexico. There's a couple of things that are at work here that we need to explain. The first one is really this. So the Spanish now have to make a decision. You have all of this land that you claim. Some of it has mineral wealth. Almost all of it has hostile Native American groups. What do you do with them? How do you incorporate them into a growing Spanish empire? Well, the Spanish attempt to create what we call as the encomienda system. The encomienda system essentially was a plantation system that used the Native Americans for slave labor. Cortez himself owns an encomienda and is among the first to do so on islands in the Caribbean, in places like Cuba today, for example, right, in Puerto Rico. This is where we see the slave labor enforced upon the Native Americans beginning to, as Europeans and the Native Americans come into closer and closer contact with one another, begin to kill off Native Americans in large, overwhelming numbers. So much so that it's safe to say that perhaps 95% of the Native American population is killed within a century from 1550 to 1650. The Spanish have a couple of problems, though. And whenever we think about those problems for just a moment, right, what we have to think about is this. The Protestant Reformation begins when Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses to a door inviting debate in southern Germany, in Wittenberg. Now, what's really interesting for us is this. Luther's Protestant Reformation means there's going to be religious competition, religious strife, religious tension, and eventually religious conflict all across the European continent for the next century and a half. What does that have to do with what's happening in North America? Well, it has everything to do with it in a way. Spain becomes the protector of Catholicism. You have all of these Native Americans who are becoming your subjects. So now one of the goals, right, if they're going to be good subjects of the Spanish crown of the Spanish Empire, one of the goals becomes, when you develop this encomienda system, that you also begin the process of converting the Native Americans to Catholicism. This also leads to competition, right? As Spain gains a leg up on the affairs of the New World, other European powers are also seeking converts for their religious faiths that are based around their own cultural identities, okay? And of course, we're going to see a number of Protestant groups moving into North America at the dawn of the 17th century, whenever the British began their exercise in creating a colonial American empire for themselves. But right now, in the first half of the 16th century, the Spanish and the Portuguese are the major game in town. The French are exploring North America in the first half of the 16th century. They do come to explore again under Champlain, Sieur de Champlain, at the beginning of the 17th century. In 1608, he establishes Quebec. So the French also are competing with the Spanish and with the English to gain holdings in North America. So in other words, this is like a European race for imperialism, much like what we would see, for example, in the second half of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. Think of this as a first age of European imperialism. Think about the economic system that these three countries are going to base and add Portugal to that mix in Brazil, that they're going to add to their arsenal, right, of governing their empires by. And we call that, of course, mercantilism. The idea is that the economic development of these European countries is going to be tied to the amount of resources that they can gather or acquire from their colonies, right? The problem with Spain is twofold. Number one, I have all of this territory to govern, and it is vast by any standard of the imagination. I have hostile groups of people, diverse groups, huge populations of them by the mid-16th century living on the lands that I am claiming. How do I deal with them? Well, there's two schools of thought. On the one hand, there's a school of thought by Renaissance thinkers like Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda that the Native Americans are not quite human, that they're subhuman in some respects, that they do not have advanced cultures, and so therefore it makes it easier for the Spanish to therefore enslave them. However, there's another point of view by Bartolomé de las Casas in the mid-16th century. He basically says, in his experience, owning an encomienda, being a priest and a missionary in the Caribbean, that they can become good Christian subjects. What we see that happens is this. In the beginning, de las Casas loses the argument. And the Native American and the encomienda system expand under Spanish rule. Now we know that this leads to epidemic diseases that kill a large number of Native Americans. But de las Casas goes to his grave because of something that we refer to indirectly as the Black Legend. De las Casas basically says, look, the brutality of the Spanish, the brutality of the encomienda system, the epidemic diseases, they're wiping out the Native American population. So therefore, for the Spanish, and to some extent too the Portuguese, right, who are actually in the forefront of this trade, in order to supplant that economic system and make it successful by removing Native Americans from it, we begin to see the importation of African slaves into the Caribbean for the very first time in the early decades of the 16th century. But after 1550, as more Native Americans continually die out over the next century, we begin to see African slavery supplanting that Native American encomienda system. Okay? Now, it's true. The religious wars do drive settlement into the Americas. But it's also true that Spain, from 1550 to 1580, goes through what we would call a long, precipitous decline. Why? Spain is a resource-poor, rich country, and still is to this day on the European continent. Spain's dependent upon resources from its colonies, but it's also dependent upon resources from its European neighbors. Spain has found so much silver and has created a global currency as an extension for trade that for the very first time we have a global economy developing with the Spanish currency of the peso at its heart. But there's so much silver in circulation that we also see global inflation within that economy as well. Spain's heavily dependent upon its possessions in Northern Europe, such as what we will call the Netherlands today, the Dutch, right? The Dutch, however, revolt beginning in 1567 and eventually break away from Spain. The Dutch also have a vibrant financial sector, a banking system that the Spanish had long depended upon. The Dutch have the world's largest merchant fleet. It had been an extension of Spanish naval power. The Spanish have to deal with the Ottoman Empire, a Muslim empire that essentially, was moving into Christian Europe from the east. The Spanish, being the defenders of Catholicism, end up fighting long, protracted struggles against the Ottoman world. The wars for religion on the European continent further weaken the Spanish Empire. Spain wants to return England to Catholicism. England is ruled by a woman beginning in 1558, and her name is Elizabeth I. And what's interesting is that feeling like she would be a weak ruler, Philip IV, the king of Spain at this time, wants to try to, Philip II wants to try to remove Elizabeth from power and return England to Catholicism. Spain's already in dire straits by the 1580s. Perhaps the Battle of the Spanish Armada is the finishing stroke for the Spanish Empire. After this, Spain no longer is the major naval power, no longer is the major military power, and no longer does it have the economic capability of holding together such a large, expansive empire as it once had a century earlier. By the beginning of the 17th century, the Spanish are introducing what we would call the mission system for the very first time into the lives of their settlements and settlers who are coming into North America in small measure. Now, one of the things that I want us to think about is this. This is where Spanish dominance comes to an end in North America by the dawn of the 17th century. But it's also where the English begin to be more assertive, and they begin to establish their first colonies. And the French begin to establish their first colonies. And the Dutch begin to establish their first colonies in North America. In fact, the Spanish do not establish any colonies in the present-day United States, with the exception of St. Augustine in 1565, without having to worry, without this idea of having to worry about European competitors. The fear of the French creating a colony in Florida called Fort Caroline is what actually inspired the Spanish to create St. Augustine in Florida in the first place. It's the settlement of Jamestown and the settlement of what will become Quebec by the French, and the settlement eventually of the areas that will become New York. In other words, it's European competition that breaks the Spanish out of the mold and mindset that there's nothing valuable here in North America. And so the Spanish actually set up what becomes their second and third major settlements at Santa Fe and Taos in present-day New Mexico, at roughly the same time that Jamestown and Montreal are established, or Quebec is established in North America by the English and the French, respectively. So it's competition that really leads the Spanish to step into North America. And when the Spanish do step into North America with the mission system, they also have a choice, right? These missions are based around religious communities, and the idea is that you're going to continue the process of converting Native Americans to Catholicism, and you're going to do what De las Casas had wanted, make them into good Spanish subjects in places like California, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Texas. How well does it work? Well, the results are mixed. But one thing is for certain, right? We begin to see a blended hybrid population. The French will also have a blended hybrid population. In other words, we will see Europeans intermarrying with the Native American populations when we look at what's happening in the French colonies in New France and what's happening in the Spanish colonies in New Spain. The English will never intermarry with the Native American groups, nor will they intermarry with the African slave population that's being also transported into their colonies as well. There's one thing that I want to talk about that goes with the next period in time, but we associate it with this one because it makes a tremendous change in Native American culture. And I want to grab my stool to do it because it's really important. Remember, the Spanish established, because of European competition, their major settlements, aside from St. Augustine in Florida, in what would be present-day New Mexico today, in Santa Fe and in Taos. By 1680, Native American groups that, under the leadership of a Native American man for figurehead by the name of Popé, create the greatest insurrection in the Native American world against a European power. And from 1680 to 1692, they actually expel the Spanish from New Mexico. Now, for people who are interested in Texas history, in 1682, after being expelled, the Spanish actually established the trading outpost of what becomes El Paso in present-day Texas. But from 1680 to 1692, in that brief span of time, the Native Americans, who for almost 80 years had been under Spanish subjugation, they learned how to deal with horses, they learned how to deal with cattle, they learned how to deal with Spanish livestock. It's true that when the De Soto expedition came through the southeastern United States, that pigs and other animals actually get loose and create wild populations of livestock in the southeastern United States. But the other thing that's really interesting is that during that 12-year span of time, cattle now become wild on the Texas and New Mexico plains, and so do horses. And Native American groups in 1540, when Coronado is crossing the state plains of Texas, now began to incorporate the horse for the very first time. So what we think of as a culture that didn't exist, the culture of the Plains Indian, of the Native Americans of the plains, and the culture of the horse, and the culture of the buffalo. And they're also having their first experience with firearms, with weapons, with guns, with European weapons. Now all of a sudden we see the emergence of the plains culture of the Native Americans. And they will be the last Native Americans to resist the expansion of Anglo-Americans into the American West. Okay? Now, for us, right, I want us to think about a couple of things before we end this period, okay? So, Europeans came here for resources. Those resources are not just mineral-based. They're not just coming for gold and silver. By the dawn of the 17th century, they're coming here because there's an abundance of land. There's the ability to actually put overwhelming populations into the Americas. There's the ability to have a healthier diet. In other words, while Native Americans were being killed off by this so-called, what we would call Columbian exchange, right, or what we refer to as the Columbian exchange, in a sense, the European populations were actually becoming healthier. And in a sense, also, because of that, Europeans are living longer. And therefore, because European populations grow and grow beyond the capacity of the mother countries to be able to provide for them, we also see what in the 17th century, immigration from those countries into the Americas as a result. Now, there's something else that's really interesting about this, and I want us to think about this for just a moment, but in a very different sense. The French, the Dutch, and the Spanish, but the French and the Dutch respectively, are here for the fur trade in large respects because it's such a valuable moneymaker on the European continent. But to say that right, they established good relationships with the Native Americans. And therefore, in the Dutch colonies and in the French colonies, those colonies, even up to 1750, even into at the end of the next period on the timeline in APUS history, those colonies still remain very thinly populated, and so do those of the Spanish. However, the English colonies, beginning with Jamestown, that developed starting in 1607, and then later the New England Puritan colonies, beginning with Plymouth in 1619, 1620, those colonies actually become settled with ever-growing populations. In other words, the English at this point in time are going to have, from the beginning, an overwhelming population advantage. And it's that population and the technological advantages and resources that they bring with them that ultimately are going to mean that over the course of that next period or period two, we begin to see the English and later, of course, white Americans becoming the dominant population in what will become eventually the United States.